I'm Grant Walker. Welcome to Last Call for Wednesday, the 22nd of July. And I'll be back with a heads up Thursday, 10 a.m. To Canterbury and the RMA. Canterbury is being used as a guinea pig to trial a number of plan review processes under the RMA, according to David Pedley, a lawyer at Adderley Head. He says they may be rolled out around the country. Fast-track processes have been adopted post-earthquakes in the Christchurch Central Recovery Plan and the Land Use Recovery Plan. The main features have been reliance on information consultation before the statutory process begins, written submissions on the draft document, either no hearing or a truncated hearing with limited time available to attend and present a case in support of a submission, final decisions made by the relevant minister rather than the local authorities, and removal of usual appeal rights. Another fast-track process underway is for the proposed Christchurch Replacement District Plan, similar to the process adopted for the Auckland Unitary Plan, with an independent panel made up of judges and commissioners. Few would argue, he says, that processes for the development of some plans have gone on for too long. However, one of the reasons is the issues are complex and directly affect private property rights. Mr. Pedley says reducing the length of time that these processes take should not be seen as the ultimate goal. If this aim is pursued in isolation, there is a real risk the quality of the decisions will be compromised and the plans will be created that do not reflect the aspirations of the community. Although this one-stop approach may be appropriate post-earthquake, the same justification does not exist in normal circumstances. Certain aspects of a fast-track process have merit, including greater emphasis on pre-notification consultation and the use of pre-hearing meetings or mediations. However, other aspects, such as a formal one-stop process with no appeal rights to the Environment Court, are much more contentious. He says in addition to the issue of public participation is whether fast-track decisions ultimately lead to better decisions. He said there is little point in getting through a process quickly if the consequence of such haste is that the quality of the final plan is compromised. In terms of the quality and nature of submissions and evidence, he said informal consultation prior to notification generally attracts a reasonable amount of public input, as such input can be provided at low cost and with limited formal requirements. However, Mr. Pedley said once a plan enters a fast-track hearing process, it tends to become dominated by those submitters that have the resources to keep up with the process and participate to the extent that's required. A common theme of all of these processes to date has been a lack of appeal rights to the Environment Court. Some may see this as a good thing, as appeals to the Environment Court will inevitably add further time to the process. However, he said the right to appeal the decision on its merits provides an important check and balance on decision-making, and it can significantly enhance the quality of the final plan that's approved. In poll results, most NBR member subscribers polled are interested in investing in NZX's new exchange-traded fund range. The NZX's Smart Shares unit announced this morning it will launch 9 more exchange-traded funds to join the existing 10, with quotation on the main board expected to start July 29. The ETFs invest in underlying index tracking funds run by Vanguard Group, the world's biggest mutual fund company, with about $3 trillion US under management. Each Smart Shares fund will have PIE tax rate status, which means income is taxed at 28% in New Zealand dollars. Many NBR subscribers are willing to put their money into the new ETFs. 59% say they are considering investing, while 41% say they're not interested. But discussion on the original article shows readers are not convinced, despite the ease of using a local service. The Smart Shares option provides best value for money over US-listed or ASX ETF equivalents. According to the prospectus, fees to NZX are 0.3% a year for the S&P 500 fund and 0.45% for the rest of the funds, from which all expenses are paid. Underlying fund expenses are to be paid on top of that. NBR has put questions to NZX about fees, introducing a currency-hedged option, whether some funds are better suited to different investors' particular risk profile, and how many more are planned to launch. A spokeswoman indicated a response would be forthcoming. NZX has been boosting its exchange-traded funds over the past 6 months to benefit from growth in the New Zealand funds management sector, which is expected to increase at an annual rate of between 10 to 15% over the next 10 years.
Wednesday, the 22nd of July, I'm Andrew Patterson on NBR Radio, and a couple of significant tech earnings numbers out overnight. Firstly, let's talk a little bit about Microsoft, and with us, Chris Keel. Chris, what do the numbers show?
The big thing with Microsoft's earnings was that they finally threw in the towel, or basically acknowledged that buying Nokia for $9.4 billion was not a great move. They've written it down 80% or taken a $7.6 billion charge. So that means this quarter last year they made almost $5 billion. This quarter they've made a $3 billion loss on that write-down, which is their largest ever.
It's a painful write-down, isn't it? Because it really shows just how bad Nokia was at the time that they took them over.
Yeah, and they've also said they're laying off about 7% of their workforce, or about several thousand people. It's just in retrospect, though, even at the time, people were scratching their heads because obviously Nokia had a big market share, but it was under a lot of pressure from Apple and Android, and it wasn't clear how it could get traction, and it hasn't. And at the same time, it's possibly alienated some people like Samsung and Sony and LG who could have adopted Windows Phone, or in Samsung's case could have pushed it a bit harder, but they saw Microsoft coming onto their turf, competing against them in hardware, so it was hard to see how that would work, and in eventuality it hasn't worked.
There were also some suggestions at the time that Microsoft was buying its patents and its IP and so forth. Clearly there wasn't a lot of value in that either, but by the extent of this write-down. Yeah,
they're sort of refocusing, and they're saying they'll still release some phones in the Lumia series, which used to be called Nokia Lumia, just Lumia, but they're going to be high-end phones. They'll go back to doing, we'll start doing what Google's been doing with its own phones, which is use them as a high-end sort of show pony piece to display what its Windows Phone software is capable of.
Now, also revenue dropping 5% for the company as well, and of course this is a reflection of the continued decline in hardware sales.
Yeah, the PC market has been quite soft. There's been sort of a long-term decline, but there's also an unfavourable comparison with this time last year when there was the big boom and they pulled support for Windows XP. So a lot of people had to buy new PCs whether they liked it or not. So there's a bit of a harsh contrast to that as well.
How important is Windows 10, the launch next week, going to be? I mean, there's a lot riding on this for Microsoft now, isn't there?
There is. It's not going to be immediately important for their bottom line because they've decided to make it free. So it'll be the first free Windows upgrade. But Microsoft's new CEO is really hoping that it will help turn the PC market around, and because it's the same interface across the Surface tablets, Windows Phone and the PCs, he's hoping it will lift all boats. And
we will watch with interest. There'll be plenty of interest in that release as well too next week, and you'll obviously be covering that for us. Chris Gill, thanks for joining us on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio. With Clooney Restaurant, an unparalleled private dining room choice. NBR Radio.
NBR Radio, Wednesday the 22nd of July. I'm Andrew Patterson, and with me Nathan Smith, our weekly Foreign Affairs Scope. Nathan, let's start off with Turkey and ISIS, because you've got ISIS retaliating against Turkey. 27 people killed in recent days.
Yeah, that's right. Big suicide bomb in a crowded, soft target, mind you, wasn't exactly an embassy or anything, in southern Turkey, close to the border. This comes as Turkey repositions troops closer to Syrian border, cracks down on some of the so-called rat lines where ISIS support and supply move through southern Turkey, and also look to increase their support for some of the Kurdish forces in there, and again push against Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So there's a lot of movement from Ankara, especially over the past couple of months, but ramped up in the past couple of weeks, and ISIS don't like that. Their support is quite extensive, their networks throughout Turkey. Most of the recruits move through Turkey into northern Syria and into Iraq, so they'll be watching those rat lines quite closely. Clearly showing, they had two options really. Either they ignored Turkey's movements or they did something about it. Ignoring it wouldn't have been very effective for them. It wouldn't have followed the narrative that ISIS have been pushing for the past couple of years. But hey, look, the response to this will be key. What Turkey does next.
There's an emerging connection between the US and Turkey, clearly. for very strategic purposes.
Yes. The overall the emerging strategy in that region is a balance of power strategy that the US is trying to formulate between Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and at the periphery, Israel. None of them can grow to an extent to defeat the other, but all of them have the incentive to secure the region. So that, well, I guess none of them can grow to defeat the other. That's what the British used to do, and that's what the Americans are trying to formulate in that region. So the Turkish decision to get more involved in Syria is part of that. It's not something they wanted to do in the past couple of years. They've been very hands-off in their near abroad. But the dynamics are changing after the recent election. That's causing Erdogan and others to decide, well, maybe they need to start to secure their boundaries.
What are the implications of the deal with Iran likely to have in this particular part of the world?
Well, we're starting to see already an estimated $100 to $150 billion come off the sanctions, which will increase their coffers significantly. And they'll put a lot of that money into the local industry and domestic economy, but some of that will go into their foreign, shall we say, exploitations of Syria and Yemen and in Iraq and elsewhere.
So this could increase the fighting.
That's right. We'll start to see, I think, the forces that Iran support increase their ability to fight, which means you're going to have a lot more conflicts in the region. So Turkey is stepping up and saying, "Hey, look, we're the counterpoint to this. We're one of the counterpoints, and if the United States wants to be involved further, they can maybe rely on us a little bit more." But everyone's playing their own game as well.
All right, let's turn to Yemen, where the battle for Aden is over, and you now have the Yemeni president pushing through. Which could look at effectively to press victory over negotiations. Where's that likely to move from here?
Well, the battle for Aden lasted a couple of months actually, but they tried to put in ceasefires, but they were essentially ignored. I mean, they realised that talking really wasn't going to help. This was time for fighting, and the Saudis have been bombing ever since, even while the ceasefire was on. So they clearly thought that they could move and take the initiative back. And I mean, technically, the country is still in flux, but the southern resistance, led by Hadi, the president, he is now in a stronger position, and he will move to consolidate parts of southern Yemen, which will give him a base of operations to move from. It's still not in the capital of Sana'a, but he will move towards that. And the Houthis have capitulated in areas quite significantly over the past couple of weeks. And look, the next steps will be, can they move towards negotiations, some sort of de facto control over some parts of maybe the eastern parts of the country for the Houthis, or the northern parts, and then Hadi controls the south and the west. Who knows? But right now it's time for fighting, and they'll continue to push that victory.
Greece, obviously very much in the headlines in recent weeks. We seem to have moved into this period of calm now compared to where we were a couple of weeks ago, but I guess it could be temporary. Oh,
it will definitely be temporary. The negotiations for the third bailout have already begun. That will be much more difficult. Problem is that as we've moved through this siege over the past 6 to 7 months, it's become more and more difficult for the Greek government to actually make any concessions. And the concessions that they are making now, a lot of people suspected that they would anyway, and the fighting was just, shall we say, dressings. But they made a recent payment to the ECB and the IMF, the one they needed to last week, and that was always going to come. But it came with some austerity measures. It came with some decisions that the Syrizan government perhaps didn't want to make, or had made promises when it was elected into the position of power, it said it wouldn't make. And it's very clear now that those were, shall we say, rhetorical, which the Greeks would be very familiar with. But the realities have come on board in this, and the creditors still are not moving. But look, it's having larger effects as well. It's splitting France and Germany from decisions. You've still got Wolfgang Schäuble, the finance minister in Germany. He reiterated again at the beginning of this week that an option for Greece could be a temporary Grexit. That's not something that was in the narrative earlier, and he's still reiterating that. So with the recent referendum, the recent payments, capitulating on some of the measures that the creditors want of Greece. That it was assumed that the Greek government would have a little bit more of a free hand, or a little bit more of a, shall we say, a peaceful time, but that has just made it worse for them. They've still got a long way to go, and as those third bailout is negotiated, it will become apparent.
And of course, prices moving up quite markedly. I understand that's having some impact on tourism as well.
Yes, it is. That's part of the upcoming, at least in September, October, I believe, there will be some price hikes for the tourist industry. Even now they're being hurt by some high prices in Greece, but this is all part of a collapsing economy. So it's not necessarily a good place to go at the moment. The word on the street is, go to Greece for a cheap holiday, but the governments aren't stupid. They'll notice when that sort of stuff is coming in, and capital will fly to those places, and that's a good place to grab it. But this is all part of those harder, more strict austerity measures coming through.
Finally, let's talk a bit about the Ukraine. Russia really consolidating its territory now.
Yeah, and this is, again, connected, a lot of analysts are seeing, to the recent Iran deal. It became curious that Russia capitulated, or at least consolidated, what it was talking about in Iran so quickly recently. And yet it turns out just this week that the Ukraine government in Kiev has been asked to be more conciliatory towards the separatist region in the east, and they shouldn't really ask for a lot of NATO expansion or security expansion in that area. So clearly something happened on the sidelines over the past couple of weeks in Iran. Russia was involved in those negotiations with the US. Some understanding potentially came out of that if we give our say for this Iran deal, maybe you'll give on some of the Ukraine issues. And so what we're seeing emerge is a de facto state in eastern Ukraine, especially around the Donbass and Donetsk regions. Those are still under heavy shelling. But essentially, Putin has made a big leap forward there, although quietly and on the sidelines. This is a big step for I guess what comes next, because if he can show that all you need to do is create a separatist movement in one part of a country, and then you can talk to the United States or the European Union, NATO especially have said, we're not happy, but we know the option is between us saying yes and fighting, and they don't necessarily want fighting. So I think Putin's played his cards, very few he had left, quite well here. And
we wait and see where things will perhaps begin to materialise from here.
Well, we will have to wait and see, because Russia is still in a weaker position than the US. But when you've got Germany and France both saying, hey, look, the issue in Ukraine is not going to go away. Kiev, stop being so belligerent. Then the narrative is slowly but surely changing, and maybe Russia's whole long-term idea of just waiting for the weaker West to capitulate, maybe that's paying off.
All right. Thanks for the update. Foreign Affairs Scope with Nathan Smith here on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio. Free to air online with business news you can use.
So let's talk housing. Auckland Council has revealed how many of its rates bills are sent overseas. Of the 535,057 rates bills sent out, 5,617 are sent overseas, 2,885 to Australia, and 2,732 to the rest of the world. Just over 465,000 are mailed to New Zealand addresses, and 50,734 are emailed to ratepayers. In light of the controversy over how many non-New Zealand residents are buying properties, NBR Radio asked the council for the figures, but staff weren't able to break down country-specific addresses, instead relying on print house records. A couple of weeks ago, Labour's housing spokesman Phil Twyford released data showing the number of houses bought by people with Asian surnames in Auckland. The data from one real estate agency suggested 39.5% of Auckland houses sold from February to April this year were to buyers with Chinese surnames, even though ethnic Chinese make up only 9% of Auckland's population. As NBR reported yesterday, the big question, according to one of Auckland's biggest mortgage broking companies, is not how many foreigners are buying property, but how much foreign money is pouring into New Zealand to be invested in housing. Squirrel Mortgage's Chief Executive John Bolton says the conversation should be steered away from foreigners buying property to tracking where the surge in money being invested in property is coming from. He says most of the money coming into the country is controlled by foreign-born New Zealand residents, and they're often buying more than one property, as Kiwis like to do. Let's talk shareholdings. The former chairman of Veritas Investments, owner of the Mad Butcher franchise, has sold half his shareholding weeks after telling the NZX he was an enthusiastic, supportive and acquiring shareholder. Mark Darrow announced his resignation as chairman of Veritas on June 10, saying there were several private business projects that needed his attention. His departure was scheduled for June 30, the end of Veritas' financial year. In a statement to the NZX, he said it was an opportune time to stand aside after a busy 4 years on the board. He said by the end of June 2015, the 2016 financial year business planning and strategy work will have been completed, including a full market update for the year ahead. I remain an enthusiastic, supportive and acquiring shareholder and see 2016 financial year as the year the Veritas Group shows the potential it has through the performance of the 4 business units after the recent settling in period. A few days later, he disclosed the purchase of 2,000 Veritas shares on June 12 at 68 cents a share. However, a disclosure to the NZX today revealed Mr Darrow had sold 122,500 shares, half his holding, between July 6 and July 17. The sale price averaged 71.4 cents. Veritas shares were priced on market today at 64 cents, valuing the company equity at $28 million. NBR wanted to ask Mr Darrow why he'd sold a significant part of his holding so soon after publicly committing as a buyer, but he did not return calls. Veritas acting chairman Tim Cook said the company was disappointed Mr Darrow had decided to sell, as he had been a supportive founding shareholder, but Mr Darrow had advised the company he wished to sell to take part in a commercial opportunity that was apparently in discussion before his resignation as chairman, but moved ahead quickly, and he needed to liquidate a number of personal assets, including shares, to allow him to take up that opportunity. Asked whether Veritas had a policy on share trading by directors in the period between financial year end and a results announcement, Mr Cook said Veritas and Mr Darrow are all clearly aware of the obligations around share trading. The NZX said its main board listing rules did not specifically require companies to have a policy on blackout or closed periods for share trading by staff, officers or directors, although there was such a requirement for the new NXT market. It said NZX notes, however, that most issuers have in place securities trading policies and processes featuring closed period trading restrictions that reflect the insider trading regime applicable under the Financial Market Conduct Act 2013. New Zealand Shareholders Association Director Martin Watson said, clearly on the face of it, these things are not a good look, but personal circumstances can change. Given the inconsistency between his statement and subsequent share trading, Mr Watson said, I would have thought it would have been worth him giving some explanation.
NBR Radio, Wednesday the 22nd of July. I'm Andrew Patterson, and extreme positions with the Kiwi dollar at the moment, particularly those choosing to go short with me. Jason Walls. Jason, just how extreme has this position become?
Well, it's pretty extreme. We haven't seen this in a long time. And essentially, the screenshots that I've been looking at go back about 10 years and nowhere near at this level in 10 years. I mean, something like this, for people that enjoy talking about and writing about currency, which is about 1% of the world, I guess, find this kind of stuff very exciting. And it's as you said before, it is definitely at an extreme level. We reported the last week that it was, or we ran the headline that it was an extreme level. That was because there was 18,000 future New Zealand dollar future contracts being sold short in the international money market. We can reveal that this week that number has increased to almost 20,000, so 19,654. And so that's obviously an increase of about 1,000 on the week before.
In fact, if you look at the long-short balance, around 13,500 long versus 33,000 short, it's pretty obvious. Although, you know, this can be dangerous, isn't it? Because obviously you get a squeeze and then the whole situation can backfire.
Yeah. And I mean, it's important to note the timing of when this is coming up, because we've got New Zealand dollar, as you'll know, it's been extremely volatile the last couple of months. I mean, we saw that we're up to almost parity against the Australian, and we've peeled back around 11.10 or 11.60 cents. I mean, against the American as well, we're seeing that we've unwinded quite a bit there as well. Now, it's important to note that we've got the official cash rate announcement tomorrow, and obviously most punters, in fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say all punters are saying that that's going to be cut. I mean, everybody's saying that it will, and obviously that would have an effect on the dollar as well.
Although, interesting enough, suggestions that may already be well baked in, so it may not actually have that much of an impact.
You're right, and that's the flip side of it. It's the market that's already, as I just said, the analysts and the punters have already all know that this is going to come, so the market's already factored it in as well. Yeah.
All right, and at this stage, it looks like that trend is going to continue because while there may be a short-term blip, it's likely that the trend for the Kiwi dollar remains downward.
Yeah, and it's all eyes are on what Mr. Wheeler says tomorrow, basically. I mean, I was talking to Mr. Tim Kelleher, who has been really instrumental in helping me with this sort of data, and he was saying that one of the main things to look for is the terminology tomorrow. And if Mr. Wheeler uses or removes the words unsustainable and unjustifiable in terms of the Kiwi dollar, because, I mean, that's been he's been throwing that around for a while. In fact, it was John Key that said earlier this week, and we're talking about it on NBR Currency Talk, that we're at a Goldilocks level in terms of New Zealand.
Well, this is the level that people have been speaking about for some time. That the Kiwi is fairly valued somewhere around about 65. 67.
Yeah.
So it's hit that level. So one assumes that it's going to be difficult for the Reserve Bank to maintain its current stance.
Right. Yeah, and it's always going to be difficult. I mean, we found the level. It's just kind of keeping it here. But I mean, obviously, that's never going to happen. The way that financial markets and the economy works, it's going to be fluctuating.
All right. Thanks for the update. Jason Walls with us on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett. Open for breakfast, lunch and dinner and everything in between. NBR Radio.
Wednesday the 22nd of July. This is NBR Radio. I'm Andrew Patterson. Donald Trump has raced ahead in the Republican race for the US presidential election next year. In his Editor's Insight today, Neville Gibson says this is a nightmare scenario for the Republicans. So, Neville, why has Trump become the leader of the pack, given that he has a lot going against him at the moment?
Well, there's plenty against him, and he is seen as a celebrity, a bit of a clown and a businessman with no political record. But most of the other 15 contenders are quite serious politicians, but he is by far the most polarising of them. And you've got senators, state governors. There's a lot of really competent and highly qualified candidates there, led by Jeb Bush and Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin. But the polling by the Washington Post ABC, which has just come out this morning, shows that Trump has 24% to 12% for Jeb Bush, and Scott Walker slightly ahead of Jeb Bush with 13. And an average of those polls done by another organisation shows Trump has 18%, Bush 13%, and Walker just over 10%.
So where does Trump's support actually come from? Where's his bedrock support based?
Well, he's increased his support since he announced his candidacy, and though it's been talked about, no one really expected him to do it other than as a publicity stunt. But that occurred in late May, and he's increased his support among Republican registered and independent voters who qualify to vote in the primaries by sixfold. He's generated a lot of headlines, but they've all been negative if you're just looking at it. But from his point of view, any publicity is good publicity. First of all, he insulted Mexican immigrants. Then he, at the weekend, took on Senator John McCain, questioning him as a war hero, saying war heroes don't spend the war in a Vietnamese jail. I mean, boy, did that really get going. The polling hasn't really caught that wave of opinion against him, and he may well ride it out. But his appeal is largely, of course, to the anti-Washington vote and the fact that he isn't an established politician or has shown any competence in that area. Instead, he's saying, I am good at business and I'm on a TV show, which I think's been cancelled now, hasn't it? And he's hoping that this kind of publicity will get him over the line.
But if he's ostracising himself against so many influential groups, then he couldn't possibly win against Hillary Clinton, could he?
That's right, because she's way out in front for the Democrats. In fact, all the polls show her as the only candidate, and they have measured it up. But some of the polling shows that 54% of Republicans say that Trump's views don't reflect the core values of the party, and other polls show that if he did receive the Republican nomination, nearly 2/3 of Americans show they wouldn't vote for him. So that puts Hillary Clinton in a pretty much a winner's position. The nightmare scenario is that if Trump, because of his ego, stands as an independent, say he doesn't and loses it to, say, Jeb Bush, he would get about 20% of the vote, but Hillary Clinton would get nearly 50%. That would leave only 30% for Jeb Bush or an equivalent candidate.
So the way things are looking at the moment, this is actually a dream scenario for the Democrats.
Oh, certainly. And, the pity of it is that Hillary Clinton isn't going to face any kind of primary, or not any serious one, but there's a lot of these, a dozen or so candidates, all quite strong. A new one was announced overnight, actually, Mr. Kasich. He's the governor of Ohio, very good record. He's been in the House. He was there in Washington from 1983 to 2001, became governor of Ohio, and he's led quite a turnaround in the economy there. And he is a supporter of some of the Obama healthcare reforms. He's also, along with Jeb Bush, you'd put him pretty much in the centre of the Republican Party, if not on the left, assuming they do have a left. So he's a centrist and stands to do quite well. But at the moment, his profile's about zilch.
What the Republicans, the diehard Republicans, must be really hating about this is that this is actually the Republicans' election to win. Given the unpopularity towards the end of the Obama administration, it looked like there was going to be a change in administration quite clearly. So this is actually changing everything against them.
Yes, on an individual basis, Hillary Clinton's way out in front, but if people are given just a 1-2 choice, and the Republicans, as you say, have the majority in both the Congress and the Senate, it is for theirs to lose. But they have to appeal and get a candidate who has a wide cross-section of support, and that's why I think this new guy from Ohio, he certainly sits in the centre, very popular. He's re-elected, and Ohio is not really a Republican state, it's a swing state. It traditionally goes with the presidential winner, and he was re-elected just in the last election by 2/3 majority, so he's a very strong candidate.
Why is polling so important at this early stage of the campaign?
Well, the two cable network TVs, Fox and CNN, are both going to have a series of debates, and they're starting, the first of them is on August 6th, and they're going to choose the top 10. So now we've got 16, so it's going to be pretty important for some of these candidates, especially, say, John Kasich, to get into that top 10. He isn't there at the moment, and neither is Carly Fiorina, the former chief executive and the only woman candidate, chief executive of Hewlett-Packard. So there's some candidates still got a bit of work to do yet.
And just finally, some of the media have called on Donald Trump to stand down. That doesn't seem likely, does it?
Well, probably not, but an editorial has been published this morning in the Des Moines Register. That's in Iowa, where the first of the primary votes are going to be held. And boy, they've got a strong editorial calling on him to stand down. They say he's coarsened the political dialogue, cheapened the electoral process. He's become the distraction with traction. They call him a feckless blowhard who generates headlines by provoking outrage rather than doing anything to do with the political debate. So it's pretty strong words there. Whether Trump even reads that paper, I don't know.
I suspect it's not on his reading list. It's going to be a fascinating race, and thanks for the insights. Neville Gibson on NBR Radio.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
To the NZX, NZX's Smart Shares unit has announced it will launch 9 more exchange-traded funds to join the existing 10. The Wellington-based stock market operator has registered prospectuses for 9 more Vanguard Group-run funds to give investors exposure to a number of developed and emerging markets. Dividends are paid in New Zealand dollars. Funds management head Aaron Jenkins says NZX is committed to broadening the range of investment products for New Zealand investors. The launch of these new ETFs is a terrific opportunity for investors to gain exposure to some of the world's largest listed companies, many of which we often connect with as consumers. NZX has been boosting its exchange-traded funds over the past 6 months to benefit from growth in the New Zealand funds management sector, which is expected to increase at an annual rate of between 10 to 15% over the next 10 years. To accelerate growth of its Smart Shares ETFs, NZX completed the purchase of Superlife in January for $20 million upfront in cash and NZX shares, and a further $15 million provided the fund manager meets growth targets. Quotation on the main board is expected to start on July 29. Shares of NZX last traded at 105 and have fallen 15.7% in the past year. So here are the new funds. The US 500 Trust will track 500 large securities listed on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ markets. The Europe Trust will track securities in developed European markets, including Germany, Switzerland and the UK. The Asia Pacific Trust will track securities in developed Asia Pacific markets, including Japan, Singapore and Australia. The Emerging Markets Trust will track securities from emerging markets, including Brazil, China and India. The Total World Trust will track securities from both developed and emerging markets, including Hong Kong, Norway and the US. The US Large Value Trust will track large value securities listed on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. The US Large Growth Trust will track large growth securities listed on the New York Exchange or NASDAQ. The US Mid-Cap Trust will track mid-cap entities listed on the New York or NASDAQ market. And the US Small Cap Trust will track small cap entities listed on the New York or NASDAQ markets. To our dollar, even more short positions have been added to the futures market for the New Zealand dollar after NBR revealed it had reached an all-time record-breaking level last week. This means the Kiwi dollar is a favourite in the market for short positioning, according to ANZ senior FX strategist Sam Tuck. He says although the market is extreme on short positions for fundamental reasons, such as New Zealand's deteriorating terms of trade and low dairy prices, the relatively large short positions raise the bar to further New Zealand dollar declines. Mr. Tuck says people who are already on the trades are going to want to make a profit, so the potential for squeezes driven by short positioning reduction in the New Zealand dollar is growing. He says this means there is a growing potential for bounces in the New Zealand dollar's value, even though the fundamental trend is lower. On the week leading up to July 7, the data comes out 4 or 5 days late, more than 18,000 futures contracts had been sold short on the International Money Market, or IMM. On the week leading up to July 14, the net position of futures contracts added in the IMM was 19,654, 1,306 more than the week before. The data shows that of the futures contracts in the IMM, 13,500 were long and 33,158 were sold short on the week of July 14. This leaves a net position of 19,654 contracts, extending last week's record-breaking level. ASB head of FX sales Tim Kelleher says he's not surprised more short positions were added to the market. What we've got so far is the positioning being added to, given it's 100,000 New Zealand dollars per contract. That's New Zealand 1.9 billion in short positioning this week. Mr. Kelleher expects this already record-breaking number of short positions to continue to increase, adding it could even edge toward 20,000 given most of the selling last week was on Wednesday, Thursday after this recent set of data was collected. Mr. Kelleher says the IMM in the past rarely went below a net 7,000 short futures contracts. He says what's happening to the Kiwi dollar in the international money markets is nothing short of extreme. He says the market has piled into short Kiwi positions, and this has been a very profitable trade for the past 2 to 3 months. He says even if the Reserve Bank delivers a 25 basis point cut on Thursday, that may not be enough to satiate the short positioning in the market. The market will also be looking at any change in the language from the central bank, with a focus on the terminology of unsustainable and unjustified being the key words. CMC Markets trader Sheldon Slabbert says the positioning of the New Zealand dollar futures is getting extreme, and it's been at extreme points and slightly overextending over the past few weeks. He expects the Reserve Bank to cut rates tomorrow by 25 basis points now, giving it ammunition to cut a further 50 basis points in the next 6 to 9 months.
NBR Radio on Wednesday, the 22nd of July. I'm Andrew Patterson, and with me, our technology reporter, Chris Keel. Chris, you've been looking at the Apple numbers overnight. How do they come out?
I think it really shows two tenets of the stock market, and one is that it's an expectations game. So we saw Apple's net profit jump 38% to $10.7 billion. And revenue jumped 33% to almost $50 billion, so huge numbers, and part of that was driven by record iPhone sales, close to 48 million iPhones sold, but it's all about expectations, and analysts had expected the company to do even better than that. And there were also soft iPad sales for the sixth quarter in a row, below expectations or falling. So we actually saw Apple shares fall close to 8%, albeit after a big run-up.
Yeah, so clearly it didn't meet the expectations of the market. But interesting enough, sales in China doubled. They'd be encouraged by that.
They would be. That's a big new market. They'll take a lot of heart from that. But analysts were also looking for some sort of flavour of how the Apple Watch is selling, which I guess is my second theme, that the share market really hates unknowns. And at the moment, they're just not letting on at all. We had Apple CEO Tim Cook said it was off to a great start, and that sales in June were ahead of April and May, but ahead of what? He just wasn't saying.
And perhaps, I like your line too, that somewhat insultingly, there have been only limited attempts to counterfeit the Apple Watch in China as well.
Yes, there's been one attempt. It looked a bit bodgy to me. Apparently it had superior features, Bloomberg reckoned, but it wasn't really looking the part, and no, it did not have genuine gold alloy there.
And of course, it's being launched. We've got the launch date in New Zealand, and I think the consensus is there's not going to be very long queues queuing up to buy it.
Yeah, I think we've already had the first wave of buyers who've bought them online. At the moment, we'll be looking to see whether the high-end models are available in retail. The two top models are $26,000 and $30,000, so most people will kind of want to sight those in real life before they buy them.
The other interesting aspect is that the revenue from the App Store was still modest in the great scheme of things, up 59% year on year. Is there a sense that maybe this is starting to plateau?
Yeah, I think there's more and more iPhones out there, but a lot of app makers, like we've got David Frampton here, who created the Chopper game, who have sort of kept an eye on, and when he initially sold that, he could charge for the game, and his latest game, Blockheads, I think a lot of other developers, he's found that the game or the app or a business app or anything, at the moment there's got to be a free version, and then you've got to hope that people do in-app purchases for the so-called freemium model, so much larger market, but possibly a much tougher market as well.
Now, the other aspect shareholders would be comforted by, and it's staggering, isn't it? It's extraordinary, the extent of the company's cash reserves.
Yep, it's up again to $203 billion.
That'd make quite a dent on the New Zealand debt market, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so that's quite a cushion against the various challenges they face, and obviously gives them a lot of capabilities. They look ahead to things like Apple CarPlay, which is going to be released with several models of cars worldwide, integrating the car's existing dashboard display with your iPhones. That's quite an exciting one. And there's still rumours that Apple's going to make its own television, so there's a lot of frontiers ahead for them. Yes,
plenty for them still to get their teeth into at the moment. But obviously last night's result coming up short, certainly in terms of what investors were looking for. Thanks for the update, Chris Keel, with us on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio with Baileys, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.
To Japan, Japanese business has been rocked by another scandal as Toshiba chief executive Hisao Tanaka and his senior managers resigned over crooked accounting. Mr. Tanaka and half of the 16-strong board quit after an outside investigation said he and other current and former executives overstated profits by more than US $1.2 billion over 7 years. Mr. Tanaka said at a news conference, "I deeply apologise to all stakeholders for causing these problems," though he said he hadn't been aware of any inappropriate accounting. He went on, "This has resulted in the largest damage ever to our corporate image." Mr. Tanaka has been chief executive since 2013, and his predecessor, Norio Sasaki, who has been serving as vice chairman, has also resigned. Mr. Sasaki also stepped down from a panel that advises Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on economic policy. Toshiba chairman Masashi Muramachi will act as interim chief executive, and more board member changes will be announced by the end of the month. In a 300-page report, the independent panel hired to investigate the matter said the three most recent chief executives played active roles in inflating Toshiba's operating profit by $1.22 billion US since 2008. The report goes on to say the executives put intense pressure on the company's business units, ranging from personal computers to semiconductors and nuclear reactors, to achieve unrealistic profit targets. The report said the improper accounting procedures were continuously carried out as a de facto policy of the management, and it was impossible for anyone to go against the intention amid Toshiba's corporate culture. Revelations have shocked the Japanese business world as Mr. Abe has been pushing for greater transparency into its major companies to attract more foreign investment. Toshiba is one of Japan's oldest and, until now, respected companies. It was founded in 1938 as Tokyo Shibari Electric, a merger of two companies dating from the late 19th century. In 2011, two executives at camera company Olympus were found to have overstated its profits by $1.7 billion US. Japanese companies are not unique in their offending. UK supermarket operator Tesco admitted accounting fraud last year after overstating its profit by £250 million. And the US corporate Enron collapsed in 2001 after falsely claiming revenues of nearly $111 billion. To US politics, flamboyant businessman Donald Trump has surged to the lead for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination, with almost twice the support of his closest rival. The Washington Post ABC News poll was taken just as Mr. Trump ignited a new controversy after making disparaging remarks about Senator John McCain's Vietnam War service. Mr. Trump scored a 24% rating among registered Republicans and Republican-leaning independent voters. This is the highest percentage and biggest lead recorded by any Republican candidate. The number of candidates rose to 16 as Ohio Governor John Kasich was the latest and possibly last to join the race. Mr. Trump's 24% is well ahead of runner-up Scott Walker, the Wisconsin governor, who has 13%, and one-time frontrunner Jeb Bush, a former Florida governor. Mr. Trump's rise in the poll is a six-fold increase in his support since late May, shortly before he formally joined the race. His campaign has gained headlines through his ability to generate controversy, the first over Mexican immigrants, and the second by saying Mr. McCain is not a war hero, as he spent it in a Vietnamese prison after the jet he was piloting was shot down. The next seven, ranging in support from 8% to 3%, are former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, Senator Marco Rubio, retired neurosurgeon Ben Carson, Senator Rand Paul, Senator Ted Cruz, former Texas Governor Rick Perry, and New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. The rankings are important because only the top 10 candidates, based on an average of the most recent national polls, will qualify for the first Republican debates. The first debate is to be held August 6 in Cleveland, and it will be broadcast on the Fox News channel, which has established the rules for the eligibility. The bottom six candidates in the post-ABC News survey are Mr. Kasich, Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal, former New York Governor George Pataki, former Senator Rick Santorum, businesswoman Carla Fiorina, and Senator Lindsey Graham. Their support ranges from 2% to less than 1%. Let's talk apartments. Warren and Marnie Executive Director Blair Johnston says if Aucklanders are ever going to adapt to intensification and apartment living, a re-examination of the building supply chain, construction techniques and design approach is needed. He says the country's most populous city does not have a great track record in apartment design. Mr. Johnson says developments generally reflect economic conditions, and some apartment buildings certainly mirror less prosperous times with paper-thin walls, shoebox-sized confinement and onerous body corporate rules. He says that unfortunately for many Aucklanders, apartment living is going to become a way of life. He said the country and city is dealing with issues of land supply, construction and material costs, and home ownership is becoming less likely for younger generations. He says the city and suburbs have no choice but to intensify. Like death, taxes and the demise of the corner video store, intensification is unavoidable, but it is not part of a quick fix. It is a slow, iterative solution. Mr Johnston says creating sustainable apartments should begin with good design, orientation and cross-ventilation, ensure ample natural light and the ability to open windows. He says it's surprising how often this is forgotten in building developments. Other factors for successful apartment developments are ensuring private space is actually private, developing a sense of community by inclusion of communal spaces and well-designed streets when building neighbourhoods, and flexibility to change the design within the apartment. Affordability, he says, is the final and most pressing factor. He said it's easy to build expensive apartments for wealthy people. Creating better buildings more cheaply is the real challenge. He says the rising cost of living coupled with migration to cities reinforces the need for a rethink on how apartments are built. He said we need to develop a design approach that's regular and repeatable. The architectural industry needs to be more efficient, and that requires a degree of revolution. Mr Johnson says 4- and 5-storey buildings provide a comfortable threshold of density. We can use the land more efficiently than standalone homes while creating great streets and vibrant public places. He says 5-storey housing is part of the solution, but it's not the only model. The freedom to choose from different living environments is essential to city planning. He says that the apartments must be right for the climate, culture, expectations and budgets. He said we need appropriate intensification in appropriate parts of Auckland, overlaying apartment buildings with the development of townhouses and the preservation of character buildings.
Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today. www.nbr.co.nz/subscribe. NBR.
I'm Grant Walker with Last Call. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. Moody's says banks in a good position despite dairy prices. Short positioning on the Kiwi dollar in record territory. Somerset secures a 127-year lease for new development land. And your thoughts on immigration numbers. To find out more on our stories, just log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio, Wednesday, the 22nd of July. I'm Andrew Patterson. And with me, David Tripe, Massey University's Associate Professor of Banking. David, you've been looking at the Reserve Bank's speech delivered in the last few days. This is around aspects of disclosure to assess safety and soundness. The Reserve Bank are perhaps looking at some changes here. Just talk us through what's being proposed.
Well, it's part of a larger stocktake on regulation. And part of the document involves rewriting some of the instructions they give to banks and things like that. That's not the area that's of major concern to me. The area that's of major concern to me is potential changes to the disclosure regime. And what's happened there is that they put up 4 options. The 4 options are, firstly, the current process remains unaltered. Option 2 is that the amount of information disclosed by the banks is reduced. Now, it's not altogether clear to me exactly how much it would be reduced. The third option is to exempt from requirements to disclose for banks with less than 200 million in retail deposits, and there's some mention there also of foreign ownership. So these are banks which are relatively small in the grand scheme of things. And the fourth option is to reduce the frequency of disclosure to 6 monthly.
In the speech from Toby Fines, the head of Prudential Supervision, he said the last review of the bank reporting requirements led to cost savings of between $100,000 and $140,000 a year for the larger banks, and perhaps around $21,000 for the smaller banks. Is that material vis-a-vis the value of this information?
4 large banks collectively make a profit of around $3 billion a year. So the savings of $100,000 in that context are pretty small. So they're not really material. So I don't think that cost savings is a good argument for the proposed change.
Who's driving this, do you think? Is it the Reserve Bank or the banks themselves?
Well, the banks themselves are always interested in changing, in saving a bit of money, disclosing a little bit less information, doing a little bit less work, but I don't know that they would necessarily be pushing it hard. One should be mindful in that regard because the banks do actually get some benefit from the disclosure regime in that they are able to then monitor the performance of their competitors. So I think this has to a significant extent come from the Reserve Bank. And when you read the consultation document, the focus of the usefulness on disclosure is very much on what the Reserve Bank uses the information for, rather than on what anybody else might use the information for. Now, we're in a situation in New Zealand where bank deposits are not guaranteed or insured. The principle, therefore, is that bank customers and bank counterparties in general have the opportunity to look at and study the disclosure statements and assess whether or not the banks are sound and whether or not they should continue to do business with them. Now, that means that information disclosure in the public domain is a matter of particular importance. And if there's something wrong, or if there's something that is concerning about a particular bank, we would want to know about it pretty promptly. Now, the Reserve Bank makes the comment that these are historic financial statements. Yes, they are historic financial statements, but historic financial statements issued at quarterly intervals are better and more useful than historic financial information that is only issued every 6 months.
How does the New Zealand regime compare to Australia? I understand Australia runs a much more costly hands-on regime.
They have the Reserve Bank and APRA getting involved in visiting the banks, inspecting aspects of their activities, so there's some hands-on oversight. But even then, the banks in Australia still have to provide some public reporting as well, partly because it's listed, but there's also the requirements for public disclosure of information under Basel II and other things as well. So they're making quite a bit of disclosure and reporting for those sorts of reasons.
Do you think there's a sense from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand that because Australia is obviously where the banks are headquartered anyway, that because of what they're doing, there's a certain duplication of that role anyway?
Well, the Reserve Bank would deny that, and they'd say, well, that they're interested in what happens in New Zealand. Well, that's certainly what they used to say. I haven't heard them saying this for a little while now. But it would be certainly very easy to come to the conclusion that they feel a little bit less concerned about the international banks operating in New Zealand because they're also being supervised in their home countries.
And so, of the 4 options that you outlined earlier, which one do you think is most likely to be adopted?
That's a hard one to pick because I think that I don't know whether a particular decision has yet been made. Certainly, my view would be that I would want at least the current amount of disclosure being made, possibly a little bit more. And in that regard, I've been arguing for some time that we need to have, for example, a clear reporting of the amount of risk-weighted assets that the banks have at every quarter. Currently, for a number of the banks, I have to try and estimate that by a range of different calculations, and that's unsatisfactory. Now, that's important because that tells us something about how risky banks' asset portfolios are, and that's important information.
All right, David, we'll leave it there. Thank you for joining us. Associate Professor David Tripe from Massey University with us on NBR Radio.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform, www.nbrtalent.co.nz.
To the OCR, Reserve Bank Governor Graham Wheeler will surprise financial markets tomorrow if he does anything other than cut the official cash rate a further 0.25%. Reserve Bank cut the OCR from 3.5 to 3.25 last month and signalled more cuts are on the way, although at the time it looked as though those rate cuts would be gradual. The run of economic data since then points to a speedier unwinding of last year's 4.25% rate increases. Those increases were predicated on a global outlook for inflation that involved a return to behaviours of the previous 25 years, but that did not happen. Calls for a bigger rate cut tomorrow, generally of 0.5%, have been made, but appear to be based on assumptions even more erroneous than some of those which underpinned last year's increases. TD Securities strategist Annette Beecher says there has been chatter about a 0.5% cut this week, but the fact it is just a short statement without updated economic forecasts or a press conference to explain such a major change in stance means it's not likely. But New Zealand's economic situation has changed rapidly since the last Reserve Bank update. According to Westpac Bank New Zealand Chief Economist Dominic Stevens, his forecasts are for the Reserve Bank to go further than just retracing last year's hikes. The OCR could be 2% by the end of the year, he says, suggesting at least 1.5% rate cut. The continued fall in the dairy price has had a large psychological impact on the New Zealand economy, yet other economic data is holding up surprisingly well. The services sector, still the largest part of the New Zealand economy, is still in expansion mode, according to the Performance of Services Index, or PSI, released on Monday. Migration and tourism data released yesterday saw net migration hit another record high. Long-term departures are down 8% on a year ago and the lowest to Australia since 1991. And long-term arrivals are up 15% on the same period last year. Infometrics senior economist Benji Patterson says tourism has had a particularly strong year and the fall in the New Zealand dollar will see further growth over the rest of the year. The boost in visitors' purchasing power will also be accompanied by new direct air connections to Asia, Latin America and the US coming online in the second half of the year. Tourism, he says, is likely to overtake dairy as New Zealand's biggest export earner by the June or September quarters. The most recent manufacturing data from the Performance of Manufacturing Index shows hiring and new orders up, in the case of employment sharply so. All that argues against too big of an interest rate cut. One of the criticisms of the Reserve Bank's 4 2014 OCR hikes was they were too quick. For this week, according to Deutsche Bank New Zealand Chief Economist Darren Gibbs, the Reserve Bank will probably issue a relatively short statement which repeats the message that further monetary easing may be necessary. In market news, Somerset Group, New Zealand's third largest retirement village operator, has signed a 127-year lease for an undisclosed sum to build its sixth Auckland village. The company said in a statement the 2.5-hectare site on Parsons Paddock in the eastern suburb of St John's was made available by St John's College Trust Board. Earlier this week, Somerset announced it had bought 2.4 hectares in Warkworth to allow it to add 77 retirement units next to its existing Somerset Falls village. New Zealand retirement village operators are acquiring land and preparing for a record building spree in anticipation of increased demand as people born in New Zealand's post-war era reach the target age for operators, including Somerset and its larger rivals Ryman Healthcare and MetLife Care. Somerset said within a 5-kilometre radius of its new St John's site there are 8,000 people aged 75 years and older, which is forecast to rise to 14,000 by 2031. The retirement village operator reaffirmed its earnings guidance for underlying annual profit to be in the range of 32 to 34 million in calendar 2015. The stock last traded at a record high of $3.98 and has gained 44% since the start of the year, making it the second best performer on the S&P NZX 50 index.
Wednesday the 22nd of July, I'm Andrew Patterson, this is NBR Radio. Well, dramatic news overnight out of Japan with Toshiba, the well-known Japanese electronics and consumer goods manufacturer, admitting to accounting irregularities that stretch back more than 7 years and amount to something like $1.2 billion. In his editor's insight today, Neville Gibson talks more about what this involves and will mean for the company. Neville, just give it a bit of background here. This is a very significant amount of money and obviously has caused major ructions within Japan business already.
That's right. You've got to understand that Japanese business is very very stable. It's not driven by sensational share price movements or anything like that. And Toshiba is a company that can trace its origins right back to the late 19th century when two electric companies they were there merged in 1938. So it's been around a long time. It's probably one of the top 4 or 5 brand names in the world, and it has products range, as you say, across electronics, PCs, semiconductors, to nuclear power, so it's pretty substantial in that area, and it was nuclear power that's really put the pressure on. But you're talking about accounting, creating profits. I mean, this is not a new scandal in the world. We've had Tesco in Britain have done it. Enron, of course, collapsed when their revenues didn't prove to be anywhere. And the latest and the biggest scandal in whole history of Japanese business has been the one at Olympus. That involved $1.7 billion. But that was a bit of a dodgy company, and there was a whistleblower who was an overseas person who blew the whistle there. But this has come internally from within the organisation, and they put some accountants onto their records, and they produced a 300-page report, and that was published on Monday. And as a result, the chief executive and two of his predecessors and half of the management board, basically the directors are also executives in Japanese business, that's the way it goes, they've all gone.
All right. And any indication as to what the fallout is likely to be? Because this company has seen its share price under pressure for some months in the lead up to this announcement.
Well, the weird thing is that the share price went up slightly, but shareholders don't have a big influence over the behaviour of Japanese companies. It's all sort of done very much on the quiet. But what's important there at the moment is that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has a program to try and increase governance and transparency in Japanese companies, because a lot of foreign investors won't touch these companies, and he wants a lot more foreign investment into the Japanese share market, and he also wants to see a lot more change at the top of these big companies, so they're more run like US companies or European ones, where the shareholders do have a big say. And this has really undermined that program that he's had going. And of course, these Japanese companies have been accused, they're guilty really, of hoarding their cash. But in this case, Toshiba have gone out of their way to try and disguise their lack of profits in certain parts of their organisation. So it's going to be a massive job to get Toshiba out of this big hole. Despite its revenues, this $1.2 billion worth of profit disguising the profit means that there must be big problems in probably all of their operations.
Absolutely. All right, be interesting story to follow, particularly as it's only in its early stages at the moment. Thanks for the insight. Neville Gibson with us on NBR Radio.
NBR. With a National Business Review smartphone subscription, you can read or listen to the latest from NBR online. And for a limited time, it's free. Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today and get free smartphone access to NBR online until August 31st. NBR doesn't do sport, weather or horoscopes, just timely, relevant, useful and insightful business news. So for business news you can use for free, visit nbr.co.nz/free.
To the US market, Microsoft has reported a record quarterly loss after writing down 80% of the value of its $9.4 billion purchase of Nokia's handset business. Including the write-down, the company was $3.2 billion in the red, compared to a profit of $4.61 billion in the year-ago quarter. However, after stripping out the Nokia charge, earnings were ahead of analysts' expectations. Revenue fell 5.1% to $22.18 billion, with the company blaming weak PC sales for the fall. Microsoft releases Windows 10 next week. Unlike previous Windows upgrades, the new version will be free. However, Chief Executive Satya Nadella says the new software will help boost the PC market overall. He also sees the new software helping Microsoft in the mobile phone market, where he says the company will turn around its fortunes. So far, Microsoft has failed to crack more than a single-digit percentage of the phone market. Earlier this month, the company said it would lay off 7,800 staff, or close to 7% of its workforce. Most are employees brought on board with the Nokia purchase. Microsoft New Zealand doesn't break out quarterly earnings, and the picture is murked by some cloud services being booked offshore. But for the year to June 30, 2014, the local business reported revenue of $86.6 million, a 10% increase from last year. Net profit was $9.3 million, an increase on the prior year's $8 million. Microsoft New Zealand now has 250 staff, which was bumped up with the purchase of Green Button a year ago. The layoffs are unlikely to have a big impact on Microsoft New Zealand, where just 2 Nokia staff joined the company after the acquisition. To the banking industry, Massey University Associate Professor David Tripe says the current regime requiring banks to produce quarterly disclosure statements is a fundamental safeguard of New Zealand's banking system. He acknowledges the nation's banks are widely viewed as being very sound. Mr. Tripe says we only know they're sound because they publish disclosure statements on a quarterly basis. We're actually dependent on disclosure to assess safety and soundness. The Reserve Bank is considering halving the number of times a year the banks have to produce disclosure statements. The central bank says the aim is to improve efficiency of bank supervision and reduce banks' costs. In a speech yesterday, the Reserve Bank's head of prudential supervision, Toby Fines, said the last review of bank reporting requirements led to cost savings between $99,000 and $140,000 a year for the larger banks and $21,500 a year for the smaller banks. The big four banks reported combined net profits of $1.16 billion for the 3 months ended March, suggesting these savings would be lost in the rounding process. Mr. Tripe says the cost of regulation to the banks shouldn't be the basis for decision-making. He says the costs are relatively inconsequential in the scheme of things. He says, after all, when the banks are making the return on assets that they are, spending a little bit on information disclosure shouldn't be regarded as burdensome. He says the Reserve Bank seems solely focused on its own data needs. He says there's no concern about what anybody else might want in the way of data. There might be people who want to review them. That's the statements for bank safety and soundness. Mr. Tripe says there might not be a hell of a lot of them, but that's important, surely, unless it's the Reserve Bank going to guarantee retail deposits. In his speech, Mr. Fines acknowledged that New Zealand's banking supervision regime relies heavily on effective public disclosure through the quarterly disclosure statements and puts the primary responsibility for complying with the rules on banks' directors and management. He said we also adopt a less intrusive supervisory approach than many of our counterparts around the world. We're focused on governance, strategic direction and risk management with no on-site inspections in the ordinary course of supervision. Mr. Fines said the Reserve Bank hasn't yet formed a view on what changes it should make to the current regime. Let's talk immigration. As the country's net migration levels continue to hit new records and the debate about its impact on house prices intensifies, NBR online readers say immigration controls should be tightened. Yesterday, figures from Stats New Zealand show the country added a net 58,300 migrants in the year to June 30, a new record. This was up 20,000 net migrants from the same period a year earlier, as arrivals rose 15% to 115,700 in the year. Last week, former Reserve Bank executive Michael Riddell argued house prices floating into potential bubble market territory are a result of immigration blunders of the government. New Zealand aims for 135 to 150,000 immigrants on a rolling 3-year basis, or 35 to 50,000 a year, which is among the largest rates of inflows of non-citizens in the OECD. Mr. Riddell says lowering immigration levels should be done tomorrow if New Zealand wants to get serious about Auckland's housing problems. But New Zealand Institute of Economic Research principal economist Shamabeel Jacob, who's leaving the think tank next month, says immigration policy hasn't been a particularly important contributor to house prices. A poll of NBR online readers, however, sides with Mr. Riddell, with 65% saying immigration controls should be tightened in light of record levels of net migration. Both Mr. Jacob and Mr. Riddell agree that a lack of supply is a major contributor to pushing Auckland house prices so high. Mr. Riddell says New Zealand should think more seriously about reducing the target immigration level. He says if we halve the level of non-New Zealand migrants, it would take a lot of medium-term pressure off the housing market.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett, partying since 1959. www.hoteldebret.com. NBR Radio.
To the prison system, Serco New Zealand, the local unit of the UK's Serco Group, enters the period where it can renegotiate pricing for the 10-year management contract for Auckland's remand prison Mount Eden, with a blotted copybook from claims of organised fights, drinking, illicit drug use and access to smartphones. The leaking of online video footage showing a fight club operating in the prison sparked an internal investigation by the Auckland-based company and has prompted the Minister of Corrections, Sam Lotoinga, to launch a departmental inquiry, including the Office of the Ombudsman. Serco faces financial penalties if it fails to meet certain thresholds or oversees certain events, including a $100,000 deduction per instance of loss of control, covering everything from prisoner riots to disturbances caused by prisoners that have an external impact, including negative media or public perception. One unnatural death recorded in the 9 months to March 31st period will cost it $150,000. The prison operator was tracking well in the 9 months through to March 31st, meeting 31 out of 37 performance measures and hitting 13 of 14 key performance indicator targets that granted access to performance bonuses. Serco's in the halfway review period for the contract, which it originally valued at $300 million, which began in 2010. The Crown and the company will decide on whether to extend beyond the 2016 break date, including a review of the value of the contract. If the parties haven't agreed to any amendments or each confirmed no changes required by the 5th anniversary of Serco's handover date, The contract says both parties will be deemed to have delivered a break notice to each other. The one KPI where Serco has met the performance standard but never achieved its target is in reducing the rate of serious assaults. In the latest figures, the prison operator reported 0.74 victims of assault per 100 prisoners, up from 0.55 in 2013-14 and higher than its target 0.4 level. With 976 inmates, that implies just over 7 victims of serious assault in the current year. Still, the prison operator has been hitting more targets since its first review, when it met only 19 of 37 measures and 7 of 11 KPI targets, and was the only prison with an exceptional grade in the performance table for the 12 months ended March 31st. The video footage was followed by a claim in Parliament by Labour's Te Tai Tokerau electorate MP Kelvin Davis that at least one prisoner was transferred from the Serco facility to a Crown-owned prison at Ngawha in Northland, where he died. The prisoner was allegedly seriously injured in a so-called dropping from a 3-metre balcony at Mount Eden by other prisoners. Davis called the situation an absolute debacle and said Serco should never ever have been given the contract to run prisons in New Zealand from the start. The New Zealand unit of the prison manager lifted annual revenue 9.7% to $37.4 million in calendar 2014, but that increase was smaller than its 10% increase in direct employment costs to $20.1 million and a 21% rise in indirect employment costs to $5 million. It reported an annual loss of $2.6 million, including $1.5 million impairment charge on mobilisation and bid costs. Serco's New Zealand unit is part of the Global Group's Asia-Pacific segment, which generated revenue of £702 million British pounds in calendar 2014, while posting a trading loss of £201.6 million after writing down the value of contracts in Australia. The local unit began managing the newly built Wiri prison in May this year and is expected to operate the facility for the next 25 years. In market news, shareholders of AWF Madison Group, the country's largest recruiter and labour provider, have voted in favour of a $150,000 increase in the directors' fee pool at the annual general meeting in Auckland today to cover an enlarged board and give long-time directors their first pay rise in 5 years. The annual pool will rise to $350,000, resulting in a lift in directors' fees to $50,000 from $45,000 and in the chairman's fee to $90,000 from $70,000. Rachel Hopkins, appointed as an associate director under the Institute of Directors Future Directors program, will receive half the going rate. The company has added 2 additional directors since 2010, Julia Hoare and Winnis Armour, and all 6 directors are now non-executive, including founder Simon Hull, who hung up his managing director hat today and was re-elected to the board. Chairman Ross Keenan, who was also re-elected today along with Ms Armour, said the company had got off to a good start for the 2016 financial year, with unaudited normalised trading revenue up 8% in the first quarter. He said, more importantly, margins are lifting, which is good news. What we're seeing is well-managed EBITDA level performance up 20% on last year. The company posted a 37% increase in full-year net profit for the year ended March 31st, with the 2013 purchase of recruitment firm Madison Group fully reflected in its results for the first time. Former Madison boss Simon Bennett has taken over as Group Chief Executive from Mike Huddleston, who told shareholders the company had grown from $85 million revenue when he took over in 2008 to the country's largest recruitment company, twice the size of its nearest rival. Mr Huddleston said the Madison acquisition, which allowed AWF to diversify from its core base of blue-collar workers into white-collar and from temporary labour into permanent, had proved as successful as it hoped. Mr Bennett, the brother of NZX boss Tim Bennett, said he was undertaking an operational review of the company to see where efficiencies could be made, and in particular planned to push harder on the health and safety of the 4,500 workers it deploys each day. He said the number of serious harm incidents had been reduced from 16 to 11 during the 2015 financial year, but that was still too many, and he's looking to have none. Lost time injury hours were down to 222 from 240. Madison had a particularly strong year in 2015 on the back of a rise in permanent recruitment, particularly in Auckland, due to the stronger economy, while AWF suffered from a downturn in higher margin regional demand. Mr Bennett said the outlook for this year remains strong. Areas for expansion included moving AWF into blue-collar permanent recruitment, Madison pushing harder on recruitment for those on salaries above $80,000 a year, and expanding the skilled trades offering, which is a high-value, high-margin business. Let's talk farming and the environment. Federated Farmers President William Rolleston says progress made in the past few years on farming's environmental impact can't be sustained when farmers are making a loss. Speaking to the local Government New Zealand conference yesterday, Dr. Rolleston says if agriculture is to continue its contribution to New Zealand's economy, it has to address the issue of productivity and environmental impact. A recent survey by Dairy New Zealand and Federated Farmers showed dairy farmers have spent $1 billion on environmental initiatives in the past 5 years. Dr. Rolleston said a growing economy can support a healthy environment, but a shrinking one doesn't stand much of a chance. He says to make fast progress, it requires strong balance sheets and good cash flows. While it's unacceptable to go backwards, regulators, environmentalists and the public need to understand that the rapid progress in the last few years cannot be sustained when farmers are making a loss. The dramatic fall in global dairy prices and forecast low payouts for 2 seasons is expected to cause a significant number of dairy farmers to be unprofitable. If prices are sustained at current depressed levels for an extended period, some farmers are likely to leave the industry owing to unprofitability. Mr. Rolleston said as a farming leader, he has to look for solutions that enable economic progress while supporting a healthy environment, which does away with the need for punitive resource rentals, taxes and similar instruments. Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment Jan Wright said last month dairy intensification was increasing nutrient pollution to New Zealand's waterways and water quality is continuing to decline. Although she said farmers had made a turnaround in their stance on environmental impacts, nitrogen continued to be a problem that needed to be controlled through tougher limits by regional councils. Dr. Rolleston said nitrogen in chemical and organic fertilisers is a significant expense on farms. He said he was always shocked at how little of the nitrogen applied in farming practice was embedded in products that left the farm by comparison with how much it lost to waterways and the atmosphere. Technology improving the efficient use of nitrogen would continue to be worth investment by reducing nitrogen input costs as well as delivering environmental benefits. He said getting the science right was important to making economic gain as the global demand for both food and a healthy environment increases. He said a lot has been said about farming to limits, and for councils, numbers make decision-making much easier. Dr. Rolleston says, but I would remind you that the RMA was set up to be effects-based, and blunt tools lead to dull outcomes. We need to remind ourselves the farmers have only been talking nitrogen for about a decade. The science is progressing quickly. The challenge for regulators is to ensure that regulations are flexible enough to cope with the evolving evidence and to take account of improvements or reductions in water quality. Dr. Rolleston said the RMA works on a first-come, first-served basis, which becomes problematic when a resource like water reaches its limits and does not allow a more strategic approach. He said creating property rights through tradable quotas is not the solution. 3 potential answers lie in resource expansion, science to increase efficient use, and collaboration. He pointed to water storage where farmers were willing to pay for the benefits they receive, but local and central government should directly contribute.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
In market news, Auckland International Airport international passenger numbers have increased again last month, boosted by Chinese visitors. The airport's traveller stats for June released today show international passengers were up 7.2% compared to the same month last year, with particularly strong growth on North American routes up 15.4%. Over the year to June 30, international passenger numbers were up 5.7% on the previous year, transit passengers were up 6.7%, and domestic passengers were up 4.2%. Non-resident visitor arrivals to Auckland for the year to June 30 were up 7.7% on the previous year. The largest increases came from China, up 28.8%, with 65,441 more arrivals than the previous year. The US up 10.6%, with 17,820 more arrivals, and Australia up 2.3% with 17,257 more arrivals. Airport management say the growth has been driven by capacity increases across most regions, with the most growth on the China, Japan and Trans-Tasman routes. However, passenger numbers from the United Kingdom, Singapore and India were down on the month before by 9.6%, 8.2% and 0.1% respectively. The airport subsidiary, Queenstown Airport, set a new milestone in June, with more than 1 million domestic passengers passing through the airport in a year. Its international passenger numbers were 38.9% higher in June than the same month the year before, which airport management says was mainly driven by capacity growth on the Sydney and Gold Coast routes. International aircraft landings at Queenstown increased 31% and domestic passenger volumes increased 5.2%. Auckland Airport recently changed over its duty-free retail providers from DFS and JR duty-free to LS Travel Retail and Air Orienta International. The airport anticipates the new duty-free retailers will add an extra $5 million in earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortisation in the 2016 financial year. The stock has increased 46.3% in the past year. To the banking sector, the Reserve Bank is considering halving the number of times a year the banks have to produce disclosure statements, a key plank in New Zealand's light-handed regulatory system. Currently, all registered banks have to produce quarterly disclosure statements containing information such as profitability, balance sheet and cash flow statements, information on their capital position and other information such as the state of their mortgage books. The Reserve Bank has already significantly reduced the amount of information those statements need to contain in the off quarters, as the first and third quarters are known. In a speech to the New Zealand Bankers Association late yesterday, the central bank's head of prudential supervision, Toby Fines, said the Reserve Bank hasn't yet formed a view on what changes it should make to the current regime. As Mr Fines said earlier in his speech, New Zealand's banking supervision regime relies heavily on effective public disclosure through the quarterly disclosure statements and puts the primary responsibility for complying with the rules on banks, directors and management. He said we also adopt a less intrusive supervisory approach than many of our counterparts around the world. We're focused on governance, strategic direction and risk management with no on-site inspections in the ordinary course of supervision. Mr Fine's speech outlined 4 options ranging from maintaining the status quo through to removing the need to prepare off-quarter statements altogether. The first option between those extremes is to remove the requirement for overseas bank branches and local banks with retail deposits below $200 million to prepare off-quarter statements and to scale back the content of the larger bank statements to just capital and asset quality disclosure. The second option is to replace the off-quarter statements with some form of continuous disclosure that would complement the ongoing requirement to prepare full and half-year disclosure statements. He said such changes to improve the efficiency of bank supervision should result in significant cost savings for banks. He's asking the industry to provide information on the actual costs and benefits of each of the 4 options he outlined. Submissions on the proposed changes close on September 16, and the central bank expects to make final decisions before the end of this year. To the banking sector. According to Moody's, New Zealand's banks are in a good position and should be able to withstand pressure on the agricultural sector from weaker dairy prices. The credit ratings agency is in the process of updating its New Zealand Banking System Outlook annual report, which will include a slight moderation in economic growth to reflect the weaker dairy sector. Global dairy prices have remained lower for longer amid increased supply from New Zealand, Australia, Europe and the US, and a lacklustre demand in China and an import ban in Russia. Fonterra is expected to lower its forecast payout to farmers for this season following its board meeting next month. The Reserve Bank has said a second year of low payouts will be a concern for the New Zealand economy, especially for some 25% of dairy farmers currently trading with negative cash flow. Daniel Yu, Moody's Vice President, Senior Analyst, Financial Institution, said, given the weakness in the agricultural and the dairy sector, we do expect to see some pressure on banks' exposures to the dairy sector. At this stage, we are still comfortable. Our ratings have always reflected a certain element of volatility in the New Zealand economy, and any weakening will be off a very strong base. Mr. Yu said farmers are more cautious after having increased debt in 2008 to take advantage of higher prices, only to see prices drop sharply in 2009, which then put pressure on banks' asset quality. He said banks' asset quality has also improved quite significantly over the past few years. He said any weakening will be off a very strong base, and at this stage we think it will be quite manageable for the banks. Mr. Yu said New Zealand bank ratings included a buffer to counter a certain amount of volatility from events such as adverse weather or natural disasters. He said the ratings have always incorporated a certain element of volatility. If you look at the key metrics for the New Zealand banks, whether it be profitability, capital, asset quality or funding, they have all improved over the past couple of years, and we haven't actually moved the ratings despite this improvement. So the ratings do have a certain amount of buffer in them to withstand some weakening in their metrics. We continue, he said, to monitor the situation. If we do start to see metrics deteriorate beyond our expectations, that's obviously going to be negative for the ratings. At this stage, we would expect the deterioration to be manageable within our current buffers. Mr. Yu said banks have been proactive in identifying which of their dairy exposures were the most vulnerable to a downturn and work with those clients to restructure their debts or take other actions to get ahead of the curve. He said he would be surprised if banks would increase debt to farmers in trouble. A weaker New Zealand dollar would help exporter incomes, and the economy was supported by reconstruction in Christchurch, continued construction activity in Auckland and strong population growth. Mr. Yu said Moody's still expects the New Zealand economy to grow above the long-term average of about 2.5%.
NBR Radio with Baileys, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.